Welcome to the Chapter 6 Part 1 lecture. You should use the information in this lecture to complete the Chapter 6 Part 1 notes, which you should complete before you attend class. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about cells and how they're put together. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to define what cells are, talk about cell theory, talk about the different kinds of cells that exist, and then we're going to get into cell structures. We'll start with the prokaryotic cell structures, and then we'll begin talking about the eukaryotic cell structures, specifically the non-membranous ones. We'll save the membranous structures for the next lecture. We are now 6 chapters into a biology course, and we are finally talking about something that's alive. Up till now, we've been talking about molecules, and molecules are, of course, the building blocks of life, but they are not themselves alive. Cells, on the other hand, are the smallest units of life. They are the structural and functional units of living things. Now, there are many different kinds of cells, and we'll get into some of those. There's a nice big amoeba there, for instance, and there are over 200 different types of cells that exist in the human system. So there's a lot of variation just on the cellular level. In this lecture, we're going to discuss what we call the generalized cell. So it has all the potential parts that a cell can have, and it doesn't have any particular function. But remember that this can vary depending on the type of cell that you're talking about. In general, cells are too small to be seen with the naked eye. They are really tiny. Most cells range in size from 100 micrometers down to 1 micrometer. And I'll remind you that a micrometer is a millionth of a meter. So again, too small to see. There are some exceptions to this. There are cells, for instance, in your nervous system called neurons, and some of those guys are stretched out really long. They might extend from your lower back all the way down to your toes. So those cells can be about a meter in length, but they're still really fine and hard to see. There are cells that are smaller as well. Some of the smallest known bacteria are only 100 nanometers in size. And I'll remind you that a nanometer is a billionth of a meter, far too small to see with the naked eye, and even difficult to see with a microscope. So even though all cells are really tiny, they can vary in size quite a bit. Think about this. The average cell in one of our bodies can be hundreds or even thousands of times larger than the average bacterial cell. That's like comparing an insect to an elephant. The cell theory is a collection of ideas that scientists know to be true about cells. It has 3 major points. First, that every living organism consists of one or more cells. Having cells is one of those characteristics that something has to have in order for it to be considered alive in biology, and we talked about that back in Chapter 1. Second, cells are the smallest units of life and are the structural and functional units of life. What does that mean? Well, that means that if you study the structures inside this cell and you figure out what they do, that's going to give you a clue as to how that cell functions. And if you extend that, that can help you figure out how the entire organ or organism functions. So structure relates to function. Third, all existing cells come from pre-existing cells, or came from pre-existing cells. So what that tells me is that if this cell exists, I know it exists because another cell decided to divide. Cells come from reproduction, called division, not from something called spontaneous generation. Even though many different kinds of cells exist, all of these cells have certain things in common. In other words, they all have certain structures that they have to have in order to stay alive. First, all cells have a membrane. Cell membrane is this kind of skin on the outside. It separates the outer environment from the inner environment, and it helps the cell decide what can come in and what goes out. Second, all cells have genetic material. DNA, and RNA. Now, in this case, the DNA is inside this big structure called a nucleus. Not all cells have a nucleus, but they all have DNA. Third, cells have proteins and ribosomes. Proteins are a little bit too small to see for the most part, but these little tiny dots in here that look like sprinkles, those are ribosomes. Proteins, if you remember, do all the different jobs of the cell. So they transport things, they make reactions happen, etc. They're like the little people, the little workers inside the cell. Ribosomes are in charge of making proteins. So in order to have proteins, you have to have ribosomes. And all cells have those. Fourth, all cells have cytoplasm. It's a little difficult to point at, but this jelly-like stuff in here, this kind of watery substance in here, that's cytoplasm. And it fills the inside of a cell. All cells have it. Finally, all cells have to have methods for obtaining energy. Now, there are many different chemical reactions that cells can use to get energy. In this case, this cell is mainly going to rely on something called cellular respiration, which happens inside this organelle known as a mitochondrion. But plant cells can photosynthesize, that's part of how they get energy. Other cells can break down things like methane and sulfur compounds for energy. It just depends. But they all have to get energy from somewhere. Cells can be placed in one of two different categories, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. What makes them different from one another? Well, we'll discuss the subtle differences later, but here are the big ones. As you learned in chapter 1, prokaryotic cells make up the domains archaea and bacteria, whereas eukaryotic cells make up the domain eukarya. In general, prokaryotic cells are much smaller and less complex than eukaryotic cells. And again, the difference in size and complexity can be a factor of hundreds or even thousands. Now notice that inside the eukaryotic cell, you've got these packets. Here's a packet that's called a nucleus. You've got all this wavy stuff here. Here's a little packet. Those things are called membrane-bound organelles. So these are pieces of plasma membrane that have been folded around, and that compartmentalizes the cell. It makes little cubicles or little areas where they can perform separate chemical reactions. It kind of organizes the cell. Eukaryotic cells have them. Prokaryotic cells do not. If you look inside here, you'll notice that this purpley stuff, the DNA, is not inside a nice package. It's not inside a nucleus. And that all the other stuff is kind of just floating around in the cytoplasm, kind of all mixed together. So prokaryotic cells, no membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotic do have membrane-bound organelles.